In 1854, a daguerreotype was taken at a wealthy plantation in rural Georgia. The image shows two young white sisters in elaborate dresses, standing behind an enslaved man in simple clothing. For over a century, this photograph remained in a private collection, its true story buried beneath layers of family silence. When the image resurfaced in 2019 at an estate sale, historical researchers discovered handwritten notes on the back that revealed a disturbing truth. Both sisters had been given this man by their father as part of their dowries, forcing him into an impossible situation that would define 3 lives and haunt generations. What followed was a revelation of how plantation owners used enslaved people as tools in complex family arrangements, and how one photograph preserved evidence of a crime that official records tried to erase. Over 170 years ago, in a plantation mansion somewhere in the interior of Georgia, military correspondents and local registries mentioned a case so disturbing that it ended up buried in silence. The Whitfield family disappeared from official records after 1862, but not from the oral memory of the community. The absence left deep scars, marking generations with a silent trauma that only now begins to be revealed. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The photograph surfaced unexpectedly in May 2019 when Margaret Chen, an antiques dealer from Savannah, purchased a collection of Civil War-era items from a declining estate in rural Georgia. Among faded letters and military buttons, she found a small leather case containing a daguerreotype. The image showed 2 young women, perhaps 18 and 20 years old, dressed in the elaborate hooped skirts and fitted bodices typical of the 1850s. Their faces were solemn, almost melancholic, as was customary for photographs of that era when subjects had to remain still for several seconds. But what caught Margaret's attention was the third figure in the photograph. Standing slightly behind the sisters between them was an African-American man. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, wearing simple but clean clothing, a white shirt and dark trousers. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the camera. His hands were clasped in front of him in a posture that suggested both dignity and caution. Margaret had seen hundreds of antebellum photographs. She knew that enslaved people occasionally appeared in family portraits, usually standing in the background as symbols of wealth and status. But there was something different about this image. The composition was unusual. The man wasn't relegated to the far edge of the frame. He stood centrally, and the sisters seemed to be presenting him rather than merely posing near him. She turned the daguerreotype case over. On the back, written in faded brown ink, were several lines in careful handwriting. Caroline and Elizabeth Whitfield with Samuel, spring 1854. Both received him from father as part of their portions. May God forgive what we have done. Margaret felt a chill run through her. She had stumbled upon something significant. The phrase "both received him" suggested that Samuel had been divided between the 2 sisters as property, part of their inheritance or dowry. The final sentence, "May God forgive what we have done," indicated that even the person who wrote it understood the moral weight of what had transpired. She immediately contacted Dr. Helena Foster, a historian at Emory University, who specialized in antebellum family structures and the economics of slavery. When Dr. Foster saw the photograph and its inscription, she recognized it as a rare piece of evidence documenting a practice that was whispered about in historical circles, but rarely proven. The practice of enslaved individuals being shared between family members in complex ownership arrangements. Dr. Foster began her investigation by trying to identify the Whitfield family. Georgia plantation records from the 1850s were extensive, but often incomplete. Many families kept private ledgers that were destroyed during or after the Civil War to hide evidence of their wealth and practices. The name Whitfield appeared in multiple counties, but cross-referencing with the approximate date of the photograph and details about 2 daughters narrowed the search. After weeks of research, Dr. Foster found a reference in the Muskogee County tax records from 1853. A William Marcus Whitfield owned a mid-sized cotton plantation called Oakwood, located approximately 15 miles from what is now Columbus, Georgia. The 1850 census slave schedules listed 38 enslaved people on the property, but no names, only ages and gender. Among them was a male listed as 23 years old, which would match Samuel's approximate age in the photograph. More tellingly, Dr. Foster discovered marriage records. Caroline Whitfield married Thomas Garrett, a neighboring planter's son, in October 1854, 6 months after the photograph was dated. Elizabeth Whitfield married Jonathan Pierce, a merchant from Savannah, in June 1855. Both marriages included detailed dowry agreements preserved in county courthouse records. While the documents listed monetary amounts, household items, and land parcels, they made cryptic references to human property to be shared as previously arranged. The phrase "to be shared" was unusual. In typical dowry arrangements, enslaved people were transferred entirely to the daughter's new household or remained on the father's property, but assigned to work for the daughter's benefit. The concept of one enslaved person being shared between two separate households suggested an arrangement that went beyond typical economic transactions. Dr. Foster understood that she had found evidence of something darker. The photograph wasn't just a family portrait, it was documentation of an arrangement that treated Samuel not merely as property, but as an instrument in a complex family plan that would split his life between two different plantations, two different masters, under terms that remained hidden in the coded language of legal documents, and the guilty confession scrawled on the back of a photograph. William Marcus Whitfield was 46 years old when the photograph was taken in 1854. He had inherited Oakwood Plantation from his father in 1838 and spent the following 15 years expanding it from a modest tobacco farm into a prosperous cotton operation. By the early 1850s, Oakwood encompassed nearly 800 acres of prime agricultural land along the Chattahoochee River Valley, worked by 38 enslaved people, whose labor generated substantial wealth for the Whitfield family. Contemporary accounts from neighboring planters described William as shrewd and calculating in business matters. He belonged to the rising class of scientific planters who read agricultural journals, experimented with crop rotation, and treated their operations as businesses to be optimized rather than traditional estates to be maintained. He kept meticulous records, attended planters' conventions, and corresponded with other landowners about methods for maximizing productivity. His wife, Margaret Collins Whitfield, died in 1848 after a prolonged illness, leaving William to raise their 3 children alone: Caroline, Elizabeth, and a younger son, William Jr. The 2 daughters were educated at home by a governess from Charleston, learning music, French, needlework, and the social graces expected of plantation mistresses. They were being groomed for marriages that would secure the family's social position and expand its network of economic alliances. In the patriarchal culture of the antebellum South, daughters represented both assets and obligations. They required substantial dowries to attract suitable husbands from families of similar or higher status. A daughter without adequate property brought shame to her family and limited her marriage prospects. William understood that his daughters' futures depended on his ability to provide them with sufficient wealth to enter their marriages as women of substance. The problem was that dividing property between 2 daughters could weaken both their positions. Land could be partitioned, but doing so reduced the economic viability of agricultural operations that depended on economy of scale. Enslaved people could be divided, but young women typically received household servants rather than field workers, and William had few people in that category who could be easily transferred. Samuel, however, represented an unusual case. According to fragmentary evidence pieced together by Dr. Foster from various sources, Samuel had been trained as both a field hand and a skilled craftsman. He knew carpentry, basic blacksmithing, and animal husbandry. More unusually, he could read and write, a dangerous rarity among enslaved people but sometimes permitted for those who would handle complex tasks or keep plantation records. An 1852 letter from William Whitfield to a business associate mentioned, "a capable fellow who has proven invaluable for managing the more delicate aspects of property maintenance." The letter suggested that Samuel occupied a position of relative responsibility on the plantation, though still firmly under the control of the enslaver's authority. Dr. Foster's research into plantation management practices revealed that William Whitfield was known among his peers for what they called his efficient utilization of human assets. Other planters' correspondents referred to his willingness to implement arrangements that maximized the economic value he could extract from enslaved people, while maintaining the appearance of proper plantation management. It was in this context that William apparently conceived of an arrangement involving Samuel that would solve his problem of providing adequately for both daughters. Rather than dividing his enslaved workforce and weakening his own operation, or giving one daughter substantially more than the other, he would structure an arrangement where Samuel would be legally shared between Caroline and Elizabeth. The mechanics of this arrangement remained murky in the surviving records, deliberately obscured by euphemistic language. What Dr. Foster could determine was that the arrangement was formalized sometime in early 1854, several months before Caroline's engagement was announced. Legal documents referred to it as a special provision for mutual benefit and a shared interest in productive property. The photograph from spring 1854 appeared to commemorate this arrangement. The staging, with Samuel positioned between the two sisters, seemed deliberate, a visual representation of the legal structure being put in place. The sisters' solemn expressions and Samuel's unreadable face captured a moment that everyone present understood was significant, even if its full implications were not yet clear. What made this arrangement particularly cruel was that it placed Samuel in an impossible position. He would be required to divide his labor, his time, and ultimately his life between two separate households once the daughters married. He would have no stable home, no consistent community, no ability to form lasting relationships with other enslaved people. He would exist in a state of permanent liminality, belonging fully to neither household, but obligated to both. The arrangement also served another darker purpose that William Whitfield likely understood, but never stated explicitly in any surviving document. By creating a legal structure that tied Samuel to both daughters, William ensured that neither daughter could easily sell or dispose of him without the other's consent. This made Samuel simultaneously more valuable, because he represented a permanent connection between the two sisters' households, and more vulnerable, because his fate depended on the ongoing relationship between two families whose interests might not always align. The photograph, then, was not merely a family portrait. It was evidence of a calculated decision to use one man's life as a tool for binding together a family's economic and social interests across the turbulent years that everyone sensed were coming. Caroline Whitfield's engagement to Thomas Garrett was announced in September 1854, just months after the photograph was taken. The match represented exactly the kind of strategic alliance William Whitfield had cultivated. Thomas was the second son of Samuel Garrett, who owned Riverside Plantation, a property of similar size adjacent to Oakwood. The marriage would not merge the two plantations. Thomas's older brother would inherit Riverside, but it would create a powerful partnership between neighboring families. The dowry negotiations, preserved in the Muscogee County Courthouse archives, reveal the complexity of antebellum property transfers. Caroline would bring $3,000 in cash, household furnishings valued at $800, 20 acres of bottomland suitable for cotton cultivation, and, according to the coded language of the contract, half interest in a skilled male property holder, age approximately 24, to be shared with Sister Elizabeth Whitfield per arrangements previously established. The phrase, half interest, appeared nowhere else in Dr. Foster's research of hundreds of similar dowry contracts from the period. Enslaved people were typically transferred whole, sometimes with spouses or children kept together, other times cruelly separated. But the concept of fractional ownership, one person split between two legal claims, was extremely rare in formal documentation. Elizabeth's marriage to Jonathan Pierce followed in June 1855. Pierce was a Savannah merchant, wealthy but not from a planting family. The match represented William's attempt to diversify his family's economic base, connecting plantation agriculture with coastal commerce. Elizabeth's dowry was structured similarly to Caroline's, including half interest in skilled male property, shared with Sister Caroline Garrett, née Whitfield. Now you can leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Once both daughters were married, the practical implications of the arrangement became clear. Thomas Garrett and Caroline established their household on a smaller property 3 miles from Oakwood, where Thomas would attempt to build his own agricultural operation. Jonathan Pierce and Elizabeth remained primarily in Savannah, where Jonathan's mercantile business was based, but maintained a summer residence in rural Georgia to preserve their connection to plantation society. Samuel's life became a nightmare of divided obligations. According to testimony that would emerge much later, he was required to spend alternating months at each location, 1 month at the Garrett household, 1 month traveling to Savannah to serve the Pierce household. The arrangement treated him not as a human being with needs, relationships, or a right to stability, but as an asset to be scheduled and deployed like a piece of equipment. The psychological toll was immense. Samuel had apparently formed relationships with other enslaved people on the Oakwood plantation, people he had grown up with, worked alongside, potentially loved. The arrangement ripped him away from any semblance of community. Each time he arrived at one household, he would begin to establish minimal routines and connections, only to be uprooted again weeks later. Letters between Caroline and Elizabeth during 1855 and 1856, discovered in the Pierce family papers at the Georgia Historical Society, made occasional reference to the arrangement and our shared obligation. The tone was matter-of-fact, treating Samuel's divided existence as an administrative detail rather than a human crisis. One letter from Elizabeth to Caroline, dated November 1855, complained that Samuel had arrived in Savannah, seeming distracted and unwell, and wondered whether Caroline had been working him too strenuously. The arrangement also created legal complications. When enslaved people were injured, sold, or died, clear ownership was necessary for insurance claims, estate settlements, or sales. The joint ownership of Samuel meant that neither Caroline nor Elizabeth could make independent decisions about him. This became particularly problematic when Thomas Garrett, struggling financially in his farming venture, suggested selling Samuel to raise capital in 1856. A terse exchange of letters between Thomas and Jonathan Pierce reveals the tension. Thomas argued that his household's half-share entitled him to at least half the proceeds of a sale. Jonathan responded that selling Samuel would require both families' consent, and that Elizabeth valued the arrangement as father intended it, and would not agree to a dissolution. The argument exposed the true nature of the situation. William Whitfield's arrangement hadn't just divided Samuel's labor, it had created a legal knot that tied the two families together through their joint ownership of another human being. Samuel himself had no voice in the matter. He existed as a focal point of family negotiations, his fate determined by economic pressures and family politics entirely beyond his control. Dr. Foster's research revealed that this period, 1855 to 1857, represented the peak of Samuel's usefulness to both families. He was in his mid-20s at maximum physical capacity, and his skills remained valuable. But the constant travel, the lack of stable relationships, and the psychological strain of existing in a perpetual state of transition were taking their toll in ways that wouldn't become fully apparent for several more years. Meanwhile, the broader political situation in Georgia and the South was growing increasingly unstable. Debates over slavery's expansion into Western territories were intensifying. The emergence of the Republican Party in the North and growing abolitionist sentiment created defensive reactions among Southern planters. Many, including the Whitfield and Garrett families, began to see their way of life as under threat. This political tension would soon explode into open conflict. But for Samuel, the outbreak of the Civil War would not bring liberation. Instead, it would plunge him deeper into a nightmare from which there seemed no escape. Between 1857 and 1861, Samuel disappeared almost entirely from documentary records. This absence itself tells a story. In the carefully maintained ledgers, tax records, and correspondence of the antebellum South, enslaved people appeared as property to be counted, valued, and transferred. When someone vanished from these documents, it usually meant one of three things: death, sale to distant locations, or a deliberate effort to conceal information. Dr. Foster found the silence suspicious. The Garrett and Pierce families continued to appear in county records. Tax assessments listed their properties and enslaved workers. Social notices in Savannah newspapers mentioned Elizabeth Pierce attending charitable events. Yet Samuel's name, which had appeared in William Whitfield's 1854 inventory and in the dowry contracts, simply stopped appearing anywhere. The few references that did surface were cryptic and troubling. A letter from Caroline to Elizabeth, dated March 1858, mentioned that the situation with S has become untenable, and that Thomas believes we must find an alternative arrangement. Another letter from later that year referred to the solution father would have wanted, without elaborating on what that solution entailed. In plantation society, certain practices were understood but never explicitly documented. When enslaved people became problems, whether through resistance, illness that reduced their productivity, or simply by existing in ways that complicated their enslavers' plans, they could be dealt with through methods that left no official trace. Private sales to traders who specialized in shipping enslaved people to the Deep South cotton frontier, transfers to brutal work camps, in extreme cases, violence or abandonment that resulted in death but was never investigated. Dr. Foster interviewed descendants of both the Garrett and Pierce families as part of her research. Most knew little about Samuel or the arrangement. The story had been buried beneath generations of silence, But one descendant, Margaret Pierce, a retired teacher living in Atlanta, remembered her grandmother telling her about the man the two sisters shared when she was a child in the 1950s. According to Margaret's recollection of a conversation more than 70 years old, her grandmother had said that the arrangement went wrong and that they sent him away to where no one would ask questions. When young Margaret asked what that meant, her grandmother refused to elaborate, saying only that families did terrible things back then, and the less we speak of it, the better. This pattern of familial silence was common among descendants of enslaving families. The myth of benevolent paternalism, the idea that slavery was a mutually beneficial system where enslaved people were cared for like children, required erasing or minimizing evidence of cruelty and exploitation. Stories like Samuel's, which revealed the calculated economic brutality underlying the institution, had to be forgotten. The Civil War's outbreak in 1861 further complicated the historical record. Military operations disrupted normal record-keeping. Plantations were abandoned or destroyed. Enslaved people escaped to Union lines or were relocated by their enslavers to avoid Union advance. In the chaos, individual stories became even harder to trace. Dr. Foster did find one tantalizing clue in an unexpected location. The federal census of 1860, taken just months before the war began, listed the enslaved people in Thomas Garrett's household by age and gender, but not by name. Among them was a male listed as approximately 30 years old, the right age for Samuel. However, there was a notation beside this entry that Dr. Foster had never seen before in census records. Absent, location unknown. Census takers typically marked enslaved people as present, or if temporarily away, noted where they had gone, to market, to another family property, etc. Location unknown suggested that even the enslaver claiming ownership didn't know, or wouldn't say, where this person was. Jonathan Pierce's Savannah household census showed no enslaved males of Samuel's age at all. Elizabeth Pierce was listed as owning several enslaved women who worked as domestic servants, but no men matching Samuel's description. If the shared ownership arrangement still existed legally, it appeared that Samuel himself had somehow disappeared from both households. In the oral histories collected by historians in the 1930s under the Federal Writers Project, interviews with elderly, formerly enslaved people about their experiences, Dr. Foster found several references to arrangements where enslaved people were passed between family members. These accounts describe the practice as particularly cruel because it prevented the formation of stable relationships and created uncertainty about whom to obey or trust. One formerly enslaved woman from Georgia, interviewed in 1937, recalled that some folks had it worst of all, the ones who belonged to two masters. They didn't belong nowhere, didn't have no home, always moving, always torn. Some of them just disappeared, and we figured they ran off or died, but nobody knew for sure. Could Samuel have attempted escape? It was possible, though the timing would have been before the war created opportunities for fleeing to Union lines. Could he have died, with both families choosing not to report it to avoid complicated questions about the shared ownership? Could he have been sold privately, despite the legal requirement for both families to agree? The silenced years offered no clear answers, only the troubling absence where a life should have been documented. Dr. Foster's breakthrough came from an unexpected source in late 2019. While researching unrelated records at the Georgia State Archives, she discovered a collection of correspondence that had been misfiled in boxes marked Sherman's March, property claims. The papers had been stored incorrectly for over a century, which meant they had escaped the systematic culling and destruction that many families had undertaken to sanitize their historical records. Among these letters was a correspondence between Elizabeth Pierce and an attorney named Jeremiah Holbrook in early 1862. The letters referenced a problematic property matter involving shared ownership requiring legal dissolution and mentioned the individual in question having been relocated to resolve immediate concerns. What made these letters significant was their timing and tone. By early 1862, the Civil War was well underway, but Georgia had not yet experienced major fighting. The Confederate government was attempting to maintain business as usual in areas far from the front lines. Legal matters involving property continued to be processed through normal channels. Elizabeth's letter to Holbrook, dated February 12, 1862, was particularly revealing. Dear Mr. Holbrook, I write concerning the matter we discussed when I visited your office last month. The situation with Samuel has become impossible to maintain as originally arranged. My sister Caroline and her husband Thomas have determined they can no longer accommodate the alternating schedule, and Jonathan believes our household would be better served by different arrangements. The shared ownership structure that Father established has proven administratively burdensome, and I must confess troubling to my conscience in ways I did not anticipate when the arrangement was first made. We seek your counsel on legally dissolving the joint ownership and determining appropriate disposition. The phrase, troubling to my conscience, stood out to Dr. Foster. It was rare for correspondents from enslaving families to express any moral discomfort with their practices. Such admissions were typically confined to private diaries if they appeared at all. For Elizabeth to acknowledge this concern to an attorney suggested that something about Samuel's situation had violated even the already compromised moral standards of plantation society. Holbrook's response, dated March 3, 1862, was more circumspect, but equally suggestive. Mrs. Pierce, I have reviewed the original arrangements established by your late father. The structure he created presents unusual complications for legal dissolution. Both parties must agree not only to ending the arrangement, but to the subsequent disposition of the property in question. I understand from our conversation that the individual's current location and condition may present additional obstacles to any proposed transfer or sale. I recommend we proceed carefully to avoid drawing attention to matters that would be better resolved privately. The reference to William Whitfield as late confirmed that he had died, though the exact date wasn't specified in this correspondence. More troubling was the mention of Samuel's current location and condition presenting obstacles, and the suggestion that matters should be resolved privately to avoid drawing attention. Dr. Foster immediately recognized these phrases as coded language. In antebellum and Civil War-era legal correspondence, such euphemisms often concealed circumstances that, if explicitly stated, would create legal liability or social scandal. The fact that Holbrook recommended avoiding attention suggested that whatever had happened to Samuel fell outside the bounds of acceptable or at least publicly admissible treatment. Further digging through the misfiled papers uncovered a partial draft of a letter from Caroline Garrett to Elizabeth Pierce, undated, but clearly from the same period based on the handwriting and paper type. The draft had been crumpled and then apparently smoothed out again, suggesting emotional distress during its composition. Much of it was illegible, but certain phrases could be made out. Cannot bear the burden of knowing. Thomas says it was necessary, but Father would be ashamed. We must never speak of this again. The photograph should be burned. The reference to burning the photograph was particularly significant. It explained why the daguerreotype had survived. Apparently, whoever held it, possibly Elizabeth or a third party, had not followed through on Caroline's suggestion. But it also confirmed that the photograph was seen as evidence of something that needed to be erased, not preserved. Dr. R. Foster contacted archival specialists who analyzed the handwriting, paper composition, and ink chemistry to confirm the authenticity and approximate dating of these documents. All evidence supported their legitimacy. These were genuine letters from early 1862, discussing a matter the writers desperately wanted to keep private. But what exactly had happened? The letters referenced Samuel's current location and condition without specifying either. They mentioned the need to resolve the situation privately. They expressed moral distress and suggested destroying evidence, yet they never explicitly stated what had occurred. This pattern of evasive documentation was itself revealing. In the antebellum South, certain acts were so beyond acceptable norms that even people who routinely engaged in slavery's violence felt compelled to obscure them. The sale of children away from parents was documented but often euphemistically. Sexual violence against enslaved women was endemic, but almost never explicitly recorded by perpetrators. Deaths from punishment might be attributed to illness or accident in official records. If Samuel had simply died of natural causes, there would be no reason to avoid documentation. Death was a recognized loss of property, carefully recorded for tax and estate purposes. If he had been sold through normal channels, the sale would be documented with bills of sale and transfer records. If he had escaped successfully, his enslavers would likely have advertised his absence and offered rewards for his capture. The deliberate obscurity surrounding Samuel's fate suggested something else entirely, an outcome that even in a society built on slavery's foundation was seen as crossing a line that shouldn't be publicly acknowledged. As Dr. Foster continued her investigation through 2020 and into 2021, she faced a common challenge in researching slavery's history: the systematic erasure of evidence. Enslaving families often destroyed records after emancipation to avoid legal claims or social judgment. Former enslaved people and their descendants frequently lacked access to literacy or resources to preserve their own accounts. The result was a historical record full of absences where human lives should have been documented. However, Dr. Foster had developed a methodology for reading around these silences. She cross-referenced property records, legal disputes, newspaper notices, church records, and oral histories to construct a fuller picture of what might have happened when official documents went silent. Her next breakthrough came from an unexpected source: medical records from a Confederate military hospital in Macon, Georgia. While reviewing documents related to Civil War medical treatment for another project, a colleague noticed an entry from August 1862 that mentioned treating a Negro male, approximately 32 years, brought from rural property with severe injuries consistent with prolonged physical punishment. The entry noted that the man was unable to work and had been abandoned by parties claiming ownership. The hospital had treated him minimally. Medical care for enslaved people during the war was limited and often withheld entirely, and then transferred him to a work camp supporting military supply efforts. His name was listed simply as Sam. If this story relates to you, leave a like. It helps Samuel's story reach more people. Dr. Foster couldn't definitively prove this was the same Samuel from the Whitfield arrangement, but the details aligned disturbingly well. The approximate age, the Georgia location, the reference to disputed ownership, parties claiming ownership suggested multiple claims, and the timing just months after the letters between Elizabeth Pierce and Attorney Holbrook. The reference to severe injuries consistent with prolonged physical punishment suggested systematic violence rather than a single incident. In the coded language of medical records, prolonged indicated that whatever had happened to this man had occurred over an extended period, not as an impulsive act. Dr. Foster's research into Confederate labor camps revealed them to be sites of extraordinary brutality, even by the standards of a slave society. These camps, established to support military operations by producing supplies, building fortifications, and maintaining supply lines, concentrated enslaved laborers under military discipline with little oversight. Mortality rates were extremely high. Records were minimal. Most people sent to such camps never returned. The discovery of this medical record changed Dr. Foster's understanding of the case. What had seemed like a mystery about a disappeared person now appeared to be evidence of systematic abuse. The shared ownership arrangement that William Whitfield had created hadn't just been economically exploitative, it had apparently enabled or led to violence severe enough that even Confederate military doctors noted it as exceptional. She reached out to descendants of other enslaved families who had been held on the Garrett and Whitfield properties, working through genealogical databases and church records to trace family lines. Several descendants agreed to be interviewed, though many knew little about specific individuals from the 1850s and 1860s. The trauma of slavery and the subsequent decades of Jim Crow segregation had fractured many family histories, leaving gaps that could never be filled. One descendant, however, provided a crucial piece of information. Robert Matthews, whose great-great-grandmother had been enslaved on a property adjacent to the Garrett household, remembered family stories about a man who belonged to two white families and couldn't escape from either one. According to Robert's recollection, his ancestor had said this man was worked nearly to death because each family thought the other was responsible for his care, so neither cared for him properly. This account aligned with a practice Dr. Foster had seen referenced in other cases of divided ownership. When multiple parties claimed an enslaved person, each could demand labor without feeling responsible for providing adequate food, shelter, or medical care. The result was superexploitation that could quickly destroy a person's health. Robert's account also included a detail that chilled Dr. Foster. My great-great-grandmother said they found him in a shed on the Garrett property, badly hurt, and Mr. Garrett refused to pay for a doctor, said it was the other family's problem. By the time anyone did anything, he was too far gone to save. If accurate, this suggested that Samuel's injuries, whatever caused them, were compounded by willful neglect, with the two families each claiming the other should bear responsibility for his medical care. In the logic of slavery's economics, an enslaved person represented a financial asset. Proper medical care was an investment in maintaining that asset's value. But with divided ownership and wartime disruption, neither family apparently felt compelled to invest in Samuel's survival. The medical records reference to Samuel being abandoned by parties claiming ownership supported this interpretation. Once his condition made him unable to work, Neither family wanted to claim financial responsibility for him. He was transferred to the state, effectively to the Confederate military, who treated him as expendable labor for their work camp system. For Dr. Foster, these discoveries transformed her research from an academic project about property law into something more profound: documentation of one man's suffering within a system designed to deny his humanity, and evidence of how that system's logic could lead to outcomes that even its participants seemed reluctant to fully acknowledge. In the spring of 2022, Dr. Foster received a message from a cemetery preservation group working in rural Muskogee County. They had been conducting ground-penetrating radar surveys of unmarked graves in historically significant areas, including several sites associated with Civil War-era plantations. During a survey near what had once been Thomas Garrett's property, they detected anomalies suggesting a burial ground that wasn't marked on any historical maps. With permission from the current landowners, the group conducted a limited archaeological investigation. What they found confirmed Dr. Foster's worst suspicions: a small burial ground containing approximately 15 graves, none marked with headstones or any identifying information. Forensic analysis of the skeletal remains indicated all were African American individuals, buried sometime between 1850 and 1870, based on artifacts found in the grave fill and the composition of the soil. One set of remains stood out: the skeleton of a male individual, aged approximately 30-35 at death, showed extensive evidence of healed fractures and bone damage consistent with repeated physical trauma over an extended period. The spine showed compression fractures in multiple vertebrae. Ribs had been broken and healed improperly. Long bones in the arms and legs showed stress fractures that had never been properly set. Most tellingly, the skull showed evidence of malnutrition during the final months of life, and the overall bone density suggested the individual had been in extremely poor health at the time of death. The forensic anthropologist's report noted that this individual experienced prolonged physical abuse and deprivation that would have been readily apparent to anyone who encountered him. The pattern of injuries suggests systematic violence rather than accidental trauma. Dr. Foster couldn't prove definitively that these remains were Samuel's. DNA evidence was impossible without known descendants to compare against, and enslaved people's graves were rarely marked with identifying information. But the location, on what had been the Garrett property, the approximate age at death, matching what Samuel's would have been in 1862-1863, and the pattern of injuries, aligning with the medical record's reference to severe injuries consistent with prolonged physical punishment, created a circumstantial case that was, in Dr. Foster's assessment, as close to certain as historical research allows. Further investigation of the burial site revealed additional troubling details. The grave was shallow, only about 3 feet deep, suggesting hasty burial without ceremony. There were no artifacts typically associated with respectful interment, no personal items, no evidence of a coffin or shroud, no signs that anyone had performed the burial rituals common even in slave cemeteries. The body had essentially been disposed of rather than buried with any recognition of humanity. This treatment aligned with what Dr. Foster had learned about how Confederate work camps handled deaths. Enslaved laborers who died in these camps were typically buried in unmarked mass graves or isolated spots, with minimal effort expended. They were recorded as losses of labor, if recorded at all, not as individuals whose deaths merited documentation or mourning. Dr. Foster published her initial findings in a peer-reviewed journal article in late 2022. The article, titled "Divided Property Destroyed Life: Evidence of Split Ownership in Antebellum, Georgia," used Samuel's case, referring to him by pseudonym for ethical reasons, to illustrate how complex property arrangements within slavery could create conditions of super-exploitation that exceeded even the baseline brutality of the institution. The article sparked significant academic discussion. Some historians praised Dr. Foster's methodology and the careful way she had pieced together fragmentary evidence to reconstruct a hidden story. Others raised questions about certainty. Could she really prove that the remains were Samuel's, that the letters referred to him specifically, or that the arrangement had led directly to his death rather than merely correlating with it? Dr. Foster acknowledged these limitations but argued that demanding perfect proof in cases of historical slavery research was itself a form of erasure. "We accept much lower standards of evidence when reconstructing the lives of elite white families," she noted in a response to critics. "We build entire biographies from scattered letters and educated guesses about motivation, But when it comes to documenting the experiences of enslaved people, suddenly we demand DNA evidence and eyewitness testimony that we know doesn't exist. That double standard serves to keep their stories hidden. She also emphasized that Samuel's case, whether or not every detail could be proven beyond doubt, represented a documented pattern. The practice of divided ownership existed. Multiple cases appeared in legal records, even if most were obscured by euphemistic language. The super-exploitation of enslaved people whose ownership was disputed or complex was well documented in various sources. The burial of enslaved people in unmarked graves without ceremony was standard practice. Samuel's story might not be verifiable in every detail, but it was representative of real experiences that occurred throughout the South. The photograph remained at the center of Dr. Foster's research and subsequent public presentations. That image, two young white women in expensive dresses standing with an enslaved man whose fate was tied to them through their father's calculated arrangement, crystallized the economic logic of slavery in a single frame. It showed how enslaving families used human beings as tools for maintaining wealth across generations, how women participated in and benefited from these arrangements, and how the system's violence could be hidden behind formal legal structures and family silence.